Welcome. My name is Sarah Wilkie. I am honored to be the executive director at Scarritt Bennett Center, and it's really important that we get to welcome you to this important conversation that we as white people need to have with one another around racism. It's part of a two-part series, and we hope that you will join us for the second part again next week. I want to say a word about our commitment at Scarritt Bennett Center to racial justice. Since our beginning, it's been a foundation of our ministry, and want to let you know, I think the important thing that I want to say today is, friends, this is not a one or two part series of for the long haul. We've been to journey with you and hopefully lead in some areas and follow in other areas as we strive to be in Racial Justice Ministries. We're grateful to this panel that is gathered today, and particularly I'm grateful for a colleague that I can introduce to you that leads in every way in our racial justice ministry, our racial justice work. I want to introduce to you the Reverend Sharizna Jean-Marie, who has brought us so far, so fast, in so many ways. And I pray that you'll be listening and learning today and again with us next week. Thank you. Sharizna?
Thank you, Sarah. So grateful for you and your leadership there at Scarritt Bennett Center and the ways in which we are working collectively together to move this work forward in our city, in our world, in our nation. So thank you, Sarah, for your leadership. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here, for joining us for another week of our Facebook Live show. This week in particular, we are excited about our conversation, white co-conspirators, the conversation white people need to have with white people. A very important conversation. And it is a conversation for everyone, but this week in particular, our target audience is our white audience. And so we're unapologetic about that because this is the work of racial justice. So thank you all for joining us. Little housekeeping, this is Sacred Space, and we're so grateful to have our panel today. And here at Scarritt Bennett Center, our way is radical hospitality. We believe in making sure that all of our guests is well cared for. And so in that spirit, we ask and invite you all to share your comments and also questions in the comment section. Yet this is sacred space. We anoint this, we proclaim this to be sacred space. And so while all comments are welcome, difference of opinions and perspectives is also welcome, but difference does not mean hate or disrespect. And so any comments that might reflect disrespect or hate, we will delete immediately. But we do welcome you to share your comments and your questions, and later on this afternoon, we will ask those questions to our audience. Again, thank you for joining us. And it is my delight to introduce our moderator today, Lindsey Godwin. She is the assistant director or associate director there at Vanderbilt Divinity School. And she will give more of her resume to you all. But I want to say thank you so much, Lindsey, for leading us in this space, this unapologetic, sacred space of truth-telling. Thank you all for being here, and I turn it over to you, Lindsey.
Gotta fix that mute. All right, thank you so much, Reverend Sharizna, for having us, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I am excited and always just a little bit anxious, because that's part of what it means to do this work, right? To be willing to be anxious and nervous and learn in the process and be wrong and grow. So I welcome all of y'all to joining in that process with us, and I'm grateful to be here with you. Before we go too much further, I want to take just a minute to do a land acknowledgement. This land acknowledgement that I'm going to read is an adaptation from the work of a colleague of mine at Vanderbilt, Rob Nelson. So if you'll take a breath, we acknowledge that the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and live, particularly in Nashville, but across the US, There are many Indigenous people who originally cared for the land. We pay respect for the elders of the past, present, and emerging. We acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that these and other peoples were forcibly removed through and from these lands. In solidarity with Indigenous folks who have been and continue to be connected to these lands, we seek to be. We recognize also the resistance and strength and pride of Black and Brown and other folks of color whose ancestors worked, lived, and bled on this land without benefit or due compensation. Building a just world requires reckoning with these realities and working to strengthen our practice of solidarity at every turn. I have learned, particularly from Indigenous and Black folks, how vital it is that we practice acknowledging the realities of how this country was formed. A land acknowledgement is one small piece of that, but it's also a reminder of how this work is the work of white folks to do. Sharon provided a little bit of language about the shift that the Scarritt Bennett Center has undergone around this and why we're talking about co-conspirators, not allyship. And I want to read a piece of that. The idea is that allyship suggests that racism is a Black person problem that white people come to help out with. We, Scarritt Bennett Center, reject that concept, narrative, and even perspective. We are pushing for the co-conspirator approach, the idea that racism is a human problem that white people are responsible for dismantling. So that's part of the reason why we have an all-white panel today. There's a lot of, so much work for white folks to do and for us to learn how to do together and to learn how to grow in ourselves. So that's what we're doing here today. Every single one of us who's here have learned and grown because of the wisdom that has been shared with us from Black and Brown folks, from Indigenous folks. And we are here because we know that we have more work to do and that we need you to do it with us. So with that in mind, I'm gonna invite all of us to introduce ourselves and talk a little bit about what the difference is, what the distinction is between allyship and co-conspiratorship, if you will. Again, my name is Lindsey Godwin. I use she, her pronouns. I work at Vanderbilt Divinity School as the assistant director for the Carpenter program in religion, gender, and sexuality. And beyond that, I'm also a community chaplain, educator, and facilitator. And I work to create spaces where we can have participatory, hands-on conversations, actions, practices that lead us toward liberative anti-racist possibilities. And one thing I want to say about the difference between being an ally and a co-conspirator is a co-conspirator, that framework, that mindset means that we recognize that we have work to do every single day and that it isn't a goal to achieve. Like, I don't achieve the title of ally, I don't achieve the title of co-conspirator, but it's something that I have to live out in practice. And that is only, I only get to count as a co-conspirator when somebody who is Black, somebody who's Brown, somebody who's Indigenous recognizes me as such. And I've built enough trust and I've built enough relationship that somebody trusts me in that. So it's my work to do every day. It's not a thing that I'm gonna achieve at any point in my life. So that's one of the nuances for me that has been really helpful and took a lot of work for me to realize what the difference was. So Katie, I'm gonna pass it to you. Will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Katie Hayes. I'm the planter pastor at Galileo Church, a kind of next church emergent community on the outskirts of Fort Worth, Texas. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And Galileo Church has as its particular mission to seek and shelter spiritual refugees. And we say especially LGBTQ people and the people who love them. In the area where we are, if you're queer and Christian, you really don't have any other place to seek a community of beloveds in Jesus' name. We're kind of it out here. And it's at Galileo Church that we started thinking about the language of co-conspiracy for how we wanted to express our sense of commitment and belonging to each other and to our missional priorities. We were using Co-Conspirator to push against the idea of membership in a congregation, thinking about membership as being more passive, more of a client-based model where you sort of get something for your participation in the group. And co-conspiracy just seemed far more playful, but also far more active around this idea that the gospel is something we conspire in together. We've got this good news that is secretive and small, like a little seed, and with a little help from us and the Holy Spirit, it grows into something productive and useful in the world. So it's from my LGBTQ friends in the church, co-conspirators in the gospel, that I really learned what it's like to be a co-conspirator in their struggle for equality, for the dignity they deserve as human beings made in the image of God, and how different it was to come alongside them, to join in work that needed to be done in my own heart and in the systems of which I'm a part, and how different it was from thinking about them having work to do and me just sort of, I got your back, I'll support you while you do it. And then that sense of learning and evolution for me has then led to our whole church being in a conversation around the intersectional nature of human identity, and how in my mostly white, culturally white congregation, we actually have some privilege we can leverage in this season for the sake of racial justice and anti-racism work. And we're thinking about what it means to be co-conspirators with Black and brown people, our neighbors, rather than just allies. And I'm working on a metaphor for this. I don't know yet if it's perfect, but this feels like safe space to try something out. I think when I am a white ally to Black people in struggle against racism, my allyship helps me to recognize that they are hurting. It helps me to be sympathetic to people who don't feel well or whole because there's something wrong. And an ally will, in a sympathetic way, even empathetically maybe, come alongside someone who is in struggle and not feeling well. And I think that's a necessary evolutionary stage for someone like me, to put myself in a sort of passive position of listening carefully and learning what I can. But then there's a stage beyond that where I realize, after I've listened and believed the testimony of my sisters and brothers and siblings, that, it is they who don't feel well, but it is I who have the cancer. And that racism is this strange kind of symbiotic disease where I actually carry it in my identity, and someone else feels the symptoms of that. So that the curative work for racism has to happen on my side of the conversation. It's a white problem that must be solved for the sake of the suffering of my Black siblings. So this disease hurts us both, but I'm the one in need of treatment. And that is the work of co-conspiracy, I think, is to realize where the disease is located and start doing the work in that space, which is this space. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. Vic, you're going to go next. I just want to invite folks who are watching on Facebook, if you've got comments or questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We'll hopefully get to some questions toward the end. So you're welcome to do that. Vic?
Hey, Lindsay, good to see you and good to see everybody. Just want to say thanks to everybody who's shown up for this conversation. It's one of the most important ones we can have as white people. And before I tell you about what I do, let me speak a little bit more about where I'm from and where I've been. I grew up in a very small town in southwestern Virginia of about 5,000-6,000 people. Very racist environment, very insulated, conservative bubble, and had really, not really, but no education whatsoever about racism, pretty much until I started working in HIV, which was in 2008. And the reason that I began to learn about the effects of racism when I started working in HIV education was the result that the tremendous health disparity that exists around HIV and how it dramatically disproportionately affects Black lives. And so much to the effect that, a few years ago, the CDC released, I guess you would say, data that 1 in 2 African-American men who have sex with men will acquire HIV in their lifetime if trajectories do not somehow be interrupted. And that kind of a statistic is so staggering that it led me into a deeper dive into what in the world is racism, how does it show up, and how is it perpetuating this horrible effect on Black lives with regard to HIV. So I think that from the role of allyship versus co-conspiratorship, it's evident that, as Robin DiAngelo speaks about in the book White Fragility, that allies have the opportunity to basically say, I determine as a white person how I show up, when I show up, and how long I stay, and what I do while I'm there. But ultimately, as a supporter of a quote unquote Black fight that is reserved for Black lives. So as a white co-conspirator, among other things, we have the opportunity to do the work in white spaces with white faces, because that is where most of the conversations that need to be had are not happening. And so in addition to having, becoming more and more educated ourselves on an ongoing basis, committing on our own to having the conversations and calling out our white family in a loving way. It can certainly happen in a nurturing way. There's no need to shame people in order to guide people out of ignorance, as Jane Elliott beautifully speaks about. And so I think that we have this opportunity to also, so to speak, I'll just leave this right here and come back to it. We have an opportunity to dismantle what is known as emotional patriarchy in our society, which is, certainly something that is seen as at the effect of white supremacy. So for the sake of time and the other amazing panelists, I'll just say that for now, that I do continue to educate about HIV and speak, educate and think not only about HIV treatment and prevention, but also about love as an organizing and creative force in addition to a romantic notion. So that's what I do.
Sharon?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you, and such an honor to be with these other panelists. I can't wait to hear what we're going to say and learn from each other this afternoon. My name is Sharon Watkins. My pronouns she, her, hers. I am minister at Bethany Memorial Church, Disciples of Christ in Bethany, West Virginia, home of Bethany College, a small private church-related school in the Disciples of Christ tradition. In many years of ministry, I have served a variety of disciples ministries, including interning in Democratic Republic of Congo many years ago and serving as our general minister and president. And more recently, I've worked with the National Council of Churches, directing their Truth and Racial Justice initiative. The work for racial justice has been a passion of mine since high school, and it is astonishing to me how, after so many years, and this is something I think I could say in a white context more than I ought to ever say in a people of color context, but it is astonishing to me how much after all of this time I still don't know, and it's embarrassing, but it's a lifetime of work, and we continue it together. As I think about the distinction between allyship and co-conspirator, I think it reminds me a lot of the distinction between charity work and justice work. In allyship, there is a bit of a sense of the paternalism or patronizing. It a bit comes from the need of the giver to give, rather than the full out being in it together. You know, the conspiracy, I think, I'm gonna say, means to breathe with in some kind of way. And that what we're talking about here is not coming in from my need, but from us trying to move ever more into a place of harmonizing where the breathing is together, and there's a sense more of common goal and not my needs to be met. I think that white co-conspirators don't get to run the show. I mean, that's one of the things we finally have to learn how to give up. But we do take responsibility within our own communities to advocate and organize for change. There's a sense in which the co-conspirator, as with breathing, is all in. You know, you've got to keep breathing. Well, the co-conspirator is all in and not opting out when the going gets tough. So obviously this is a lifetime of effort to try to do this kind of work and be this kind of person and come at this in this all in sort of a way.
Thanks, Sharon. David?
Good afternoon. I'm David Girth. I am ordained in the United Church of Christ. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I serve as the executive director of Metropolitan Congregations United in St. Louis, which is an affiliate of the Gamaliel Network. We do congregation-based community organizing across the country. And we organize in Missouri with a group called MOVE, which is a collaborative of grassroots groups build and power around racial and economic equity, especially using tools of the ballot. And in all of these settings, I find myself engaged in the work of dismantling white supremacy, and in lots of conversations like this, where we intentionally create caucuses of folks of color and white folks, not only to learn about ourselves and to challenge ourselves, but also to do work that needs to be done separately. So I'll have a story later about how I got started doing that. But I want to answer this question about co-conspiracy, and it's going to be fun because I'm not going to say anything that you haven't already heard from the other three, but I'm going to give you my flavor of it, and hopefully the different flavors, even when we're kind of on the same note, will be helpful. I grew up in a small town outside of St. Louis that was virtually all white, and divided from St. Louis by East St. Louis, which was virtually all Black. And the way that I got introduced to racial justice and equity was through the church. But the introduction was to think about how we as nice church folks might help alleviate some of the pain and suffering of Black folks in East St. Louis. So that just built right deep into me this very, very close relationship between how faith and race operate together, and that there's nothing wrong with white folks trying to help out Black folks. That's the very simple, straightforward way that I was raised. And so I think co-conspiracy helps do what others have talked about. It helps say, well, the problem of racism and white supremacy in St. Louis is not East St. Louis, it's us. And it's particularly us white folks who built these systems that have created the inequity that we live in. One of the things I love about co-conspiracy as a mode of being in any kind of work for justice is that it lets us say, well, what is it that we want to do together that we couldn't do apart? And then we're going to have different roles. So in a state like Missouri, where the majority of the state is white, there's still a lot of really important work for white folks to do with white folks if we're going to upset these systems. So I love it because it pushes me out of my own framing and shaping as a human being, but it also gives me opportunities to transform relationships.
Thanks so much, David. All right, Carla, you're going to wrap us up, and then we're going to dive even deeper.
Well, my name is Carla Works, and you can use the pronoun she, her, hers. And it seems like I've learned so much from all of you. But I come at this from a very different perspective in the sense of my role. I'm a seminary professor, and my area of specialty is not race. It's Pauline studies. Those of you who have gone to seminary, which is so many on this discussion, it seems, that Paul's letters are really often used at the heart of some of these debates and discussions. And there's a much longer story about how I got into Pauline studies. I did not come to the study of Paul as somebody who particularly liked the apostle, because I grew up as a female in the Southern Baptist Convention and could not do what I do for a living and stay within that system. So there's a much longer story there, but I get to do this kind of work through the lens of biblical theology. and particularly rereading and reclaiming, I figure that has been used and abused in church history. And so that's my particular angle of coming to not only our discussion today, but that's where my work is focused. I teach New Testament at Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. And I'm not sure that I can add that much to everything that's been said. It's actually been quite lovely to hear some of your comments. And I love what's been said about being all in, or referring to the fact that racism is a cancer that we have. You all have made some great points. For me, as I was thinking about allyship versus co-conspiracy, to me, co-conspiracy suggests what some of my panelists have already said, that we have to start with a recognition that we are the problem and that we have responsibility. And as a Christian, I believe that means that we as white Christians start with confession. And conspiracy, being a co-conspirator, means we've got to start with some deep introspection and examining our own stories, examining the institutions of which we claim to be part. Whereas allyship sometimes, has that standoffishness of, oh, well, there is a problem, but it's not really me. And I'm happy to come alongside and help, but I'm happy to also withhold my resources when I get too uncomfortable. Co-conspiracy seems to come to this discussion with the idea that we have a lot of work to do as white people. And we need to have some very uncomfortable conversations with one another about what that work looks like. And I love something that Vic said about how we can have those conversations in loving and nurturing ways. No one's going to listen to us if we're calling them a racist right off the bat, right? We've got to figure out ways to have conversations that are revelatory and truthful, and in a way that people can hear us. So I appreciated that note. I will say that just to push just a little bit for those of us who are part of the church, I think co-conspiracy is the bare minimum. You can conspire with somebody that you don't love. And with allyship and with co-conspiracy, I feel like you can work together toward a goal, and you can work toward separate goals, but you're not so invested that you love another. And so I feel like what we're talking about today is really a bare minimum, because we're really called to love our neighbors as ourselves.
Thank you. All right, for the sake of time, let's dive in. The first question is around white supremacy in general, and then I'm gonna ask us to dive into the ways that Christianity, which we've already started doing, right? The ways that Christianity reinforces white supremacy or becomes a tool of white supremacy. But this is a place to start sort of conversation. So let's break down what we're talking about when we're saying the phrase white supremacy, because a lot of folks, when they hear that phrase, they're automatically thinking the KKK, they're thinking of white hoods, they're thinking about sort of alt-right sort of things. And that push toward focusing on white nationalism is a defense mechanism that keeps us from actually paying attention to the ways that white supremacy shows up in ourselves and in our communities and in our systems. And it allows us to be like, well, I'm not racist because I'm not like those people. In reality, white supremacy is, I'm going to use some language from Sonia Renee Taylor, who's an amazing, you can find her on Instagram. She's an author. She's the creator of The Body is an Anthropology. She's brilliant. Anyways, she talks about the delusion of white superiority and the ways that it's systematically enforced and replicated in our ideologies, our institutions, and through our interpersonal interactions and internalized beliefs. So can you all help us more concretely understand what white supremacy is and how it shows up in our systems and daily actions. So maybe you've got an example or a little insight for how maybe you came to understand white supremacy as the system that we're all living in. Anybody?
Yeah, Lindsey, go ahead, please. Please.
Okay, I'll try then. Yeah, so I really spent so much of my life thinking, just as you described, Lindsey, about white supremacy as those other awful people, and have so much more recently come to understand that our founders, our national founders, and I'll have to say also in my denominational case, our denominational founders explicitly and in writing thought that white skin was more valuable than other skin. And it's in writing, it's out there, and it's in our Constitution. And so it's no surprise when we realize that we see that white supremacist thinking is baked through all of our institutions ever since, because we've never taken it on in a complete way to fully get rid of it. So what was there from the beginning then has fed us all the way through. And it is so baked in that those of us who are white just think it's normal. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but and don't even see the insidiousness of what we're dealing with. But it is insidious. It hurts us all. The way that one of the ways that I understand white supremacy is that it is like the doctrine of original sin, which is not one of my favorite doctrines, not one of my church's favorite doctrines, but it does tend to say a few things that are important. In original sin and white supremacy, we didn't choose it. You don't choose to be born into original sin if you believe that doctrine. You just are. I mean, it's part of the human condition and life. White supremacy is not anything either that we originally chose. We just were born into this system that is this way since the beginning. What that does for me is it does two things. One is it helps me to relieve myself, at least momentarily, of a little bit of the burden of guilt. I don't have to take it as a blame. I just have to take it as a thing that is, and the thing that that needs to be dealt with. And the good thing about, if you want to say it this way, the more positive thing in comparing white supremacy to original sin is that unlike supposed original sin, white supremacy is something that's human made. Therefore, it can be human unmade. And so that's the work that is before us.
Yeah, and I was just going to say before that there's an excellent conversation called Emotional Justice that is on the Scarritt Bennett Center Facebook page. And I encourage everyone to watch this conversation after this conversation, of course. Don't leave this conversation, but check this conversation out afterwards. A brilliant woman by the name of Esther Armah, and she speaks about the concept of emotional patriarchy as a reflection of white supremacy, which is based on an understanding of power, where in order to experience power, you have to be powerful over someone else. And so the concept of emotional patriarchy then is a system, or speaks to a system, where the society caters to and bends to the emotions of white men. She gives a brilliant example of how emotional patriarchy reflects white supremacy and police brutality. And she speaks about how a police officer, with the power of the badge, the state, and the gun on their behalf, can still claim that they're in fear for their life when they see a child, literally in a park. We're talking about Tamir Rice. And they justify gunning him down as the result of being afraid for their life. So Esther Armah speaks about how this is a manufactured fear that is literally and intentionally dehumanizing in this case Tamir Rice, in order to justify the experience of white supremacy in the form of brutality, so that the white man, whether unconscious or conscious, can feel superior to the black man. And so that is one example that resonates with me of how white supremacy shows up all the time. We saw the same thing with Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta. It makes no sense to me when someone is running away from you and you clearly know that they're unarmed except for a taser. And yet, in fear for your life, you must murder them in order to bring about justice. So a couple of examples there, but.
Yeah, Vic, I'm totally on board with what you're saying around that expression of manufactured fear. Yes, to all of that. I think also that it's possible, even in the stories of police violence, for a lot of us to get off the hook around this whole white supremacy thing. Like, I would never do that, right? Well, I'm not a police officer. I don't have a weapon, so no, I won't circumstantially ever do that. But that this idea about power and who sort of owns the water we're all swimming in, like what is normative? What has been normalized for all of us? That now gets down in this really fine-grained way into everyday conversations between regular, ordinary people not carrying weapons and not going to do violence to anyone, so that when I'm having conversations with people, if I just say my church or some people or that guy, we all assume that guy, that church, those people are white, because whiteness is normal and whiteness is the thing that never has to be named. That is a function of white supremacy that we are living through. And so I recognize it now when I'm reading science fiction novels, which is a genre that I love, that I always picture the characters in my head to all be white, until I started reading N.K. Jemisin, a Black author of science fiction. And I started recognizing that all her characters are Black and brown people. And it blew my mind every time I would remember again that the narrative in my subconscious is white, because it's just been so ingrained for so long. And that is, to me, insidious and must be throttled by our own willingness to name whiteness where it is. Not always is a bad thing, which is to say my church, for example, Galileo Church, is a mostly white, culturally white church. To own it every time and not assume anything other than that needs to be named.
I think that's important, Katie, how we have normalized the white experience, and it shows up in big ways and in very tiny ways. So I'll name an example from my particular context, but first I'm going to name a very trivial example, because at least a portion of the people viewing this conversation have at one time in their lives shopped for pantyhose. And I know some of you have not, but somebody who looks like me, who I look like I have a tan on this screen, but I am like ultra white in so many ways. When I go to shop for pantyhose, I have to find my skin color, and it's called nude. Not all nude skin looks like this, right? There's some realization that has to occur that we are being told in even trivial ways that who we are, that this is normal, that this is the standard. And that may seem very silly, that it's just, I'm talking about pantyhose on a serious conversation about white supremacy. But that's how ingrained white supremacy is in our culture. As a seminary professor, I teach for a United Methodist seminary. The United Methodist Church is a historically white institution. And our seminary is very diverse. But like so many seminaries, and so many of you, again, have gone to seminary, seminaries train ministers. That's what we do. And you take a class on preaching, and it's just called preaching. But chances are we could more accurately name that class white church preaching, right? And then there might be another class on African American preaching, and it will be called that. And, so when I use, names in class, and I asked my advisees if they've taken white preaching. That, you know, they're taken aback. That's not what it's called on the catalog, you know. But there are so many ways in which we experience our whiteness as the norm, and anytime we go beyond that, especially in the seminary setting, where I'm supposed to train ministers to be able to pass ordination exams and go through all the ordination hurdles. When I don't assign the white canon of scholars and the white canon of theologians and the white canon of historians, my white students wonder if they're going to pass their ordination exams, because their ordination exams are based on white thinkers. So many seminaries, you know, are in the business of training people to think white, whether or not that's their context. So we really have to do some hard work of examining how white has been considered the norm. Because when I use the term white supremacy, that's really what I'm thinking of. How have we normalized this experience to make it the standard? And in so doing, we prioritize whiteness. That's what superiority looks like.
David, you want to add?
Yeah, I have a really vivid personal experience among many. And then I'll give an example of something we can all do. 3 years ago, our national network met in Washington, D.C., and we ran an action in front of the Supreme Court, right between the Capitol and the Supreme Court. And I was assigned the role of playing Jeff Sessions. So we actually had fun pulling out really atrocious things that Jeff Sessions had said, but then I had to say them out loud, hollering to a group of people. There was a guy who thought I was expressing my views. He actually wanted to come and punch me. And when I got done, I felt so conflicted about the words that had come out of my mouth. I thought, I'm going to go try to have a religious experience. Let me go into the Capitol and find the heart of our country and see if it restores me. And for the first time in my life, I went into the rotunda of the Capitol of the United States and I saw the artwork. And I encourage you to find the artwork in the Capitol. There are 8 huge paintings. 4 of them are about the myth of political and military power, and 4 are about cultural and religious power. And they all say that Jeff Sessions and I should be in charge of the world, and he's way closer to what those paintings describe about what our country should look like than my organization, my faith. And so I have that on a slide deck that I can pull up at any time and pair it with images of police brutality and power in St. Louis and understand that this is exactly what we were meant to design. Now, it's easy for me to talk about that stuff and separate myself. So at least once a year, I go to the Harvard bias study and I do the bias exercise on race, and I flunk so bad. I think I've worked so hard on myself and on the systems for the last year, and my score is still atrocious, embarrassing. And I know that the bias in me is so there that I'm going to take it to the grave. And so, so the challenge, the definition, one of the definitions of racism is prejudice plus power. For me, as an executive director who's responsible for budget and staffing, as an ordained minister, I have some kinds of power, and I know I've got prejudice. So I am a white supremacist, and I can't get away from it. I have to keep paying attention to it.
And Lindsey, before we move on, just a couple of quick examples of white supremacy that I see all the time that can be quickly articulated. Number one, especially with regard to HIV. An example of white supremacy is how resources, wealth, and opportunity has been allocated such that, for example, a white person living with HIV is guaranteed to be able to find a care provider who is also white. A Black person living with HIV, not so much. They'll be fortunate to be able to find a care provider who is Black. The other example I was thinking of is if you just look at C-suites and you look at boards of directors in the United States, how many times do we see that C-suites and boards of directors are occupied by white men by a majority of time and white women? And from that alone says that we consciously or unconsciously devalue the Black position, the experience that only a Black life can relay in, for example, the business world, the nonprofit world, by simple fact that the presence is not there, and it seems fine to proceed without it, without the Black experience being incorporated into the way that we run organizations. So.
Absolutely. We could literally probably do this for hours and hours and hours, but I'm going to actually ask that we hone in particularly on Christianity and the ways that Christianity reinforces white supremacy and is a tool of white supremacy. I learned the language of white Christian supremacy, talking about white Christian supremacy and the ways that Christianity has been weaponized as a tool of white supremacy from the prophetic leaders at the organization Soul Force. So little shout out to them. But I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about some of the ways in which you have experienced Christianity replicating or reinforcing white supremacy. And I'm going to actually combine two questions, y'all. But we've had a couple of examples this week that give us some fodder to feed this conversation, right? One is a pastor out of Atlanta, at a mega church out of Atlanta, who talked about the not white privilege, but the white blessings of enslavement and the systems that we live in. He's backed that up and said that that's like, it wasn't what he meant, but we know that the impact of our actions and the impact of our words is far, far more important than any of our intentions ever. So that's an example of this idea of how Christianity gets weaponized and used to reinforce white supremacy. Another media example that came out this week, Sean King tweeted about the idea of white Jesus, but I do need to be very clear that particularly Black feminists and womanists and lots of other folks, lots of Black and brown and Indigenous folks have been talking about the problems of white Jesus for a really long time. So even the concept of how we understand a Christian savior can be really fraught and a really complex place to spend some time, but where we need to get real. So who wants to talk about white Christian supremacy?
I'll drop a quote to get us going. Sharon, you want to go ahead? Okay. Deb Krause is the incoming president of Eden Seminary. She served as the MCU board president and vice president previously. And she said, I think it just came out this week, I just found it today, that the white Jesus is an iconography analogous to the Confederate monuments. It's idolatrous. It is a remaking of history. It's a propaganda about the ideology of white supremacy, and there's nothing to save, only things to be saved from. And so, it's like, as we say on the street, the whole damn system is guilty as hell. I think it's a good throwdown. So I keep talking about how deeply in my bones my white supremacy is built, and how deeply engaged that is in all the wonderful things that Sunday school teachers thought they were teaching me from the very earliest. We're not really about upsetting the tables in the temple. They were really about imposing social order and teaching me how to be someone who goes along to get along.
Absolutely. I'm going to pause for just a second. We got a question to define C-suites, so I just want to make sure everybody knows what that means real quick. So when you think about CEO level, or those sort of like, who is the chair of an organization, that's when people talk about C-suites, they're talking about like the heads of organizations and nonprofits and companies. So that's what C-suite means. Thanks for asking. All right, back to Christian supremacy.
So I'll jump in and just say that this I think this whole conversation is an opportunity to bring up something that's important across the board, which is the difference between intent and impact. What we intend is not the same as the impact. And a part of white supremacy is to think individualistically and individually all the time. Part of getting beyond white supremacy is to be able to think more collectively and more culturally and more community-wide. What I intend when I put my picture of my white Jesus up may be that I like Katie reading a book. I think of Jesus, I think of a white Jesus because I'm a white person. And so in one sense, that is just as innocent as it possibly could be if I think of my intent. So I'll leave that there. That could be parsed out in a whole bunch of different ways. It's not that innocent ever. But I mean, you could make an argument that there is an innocence in that intent. But the impact of it is something entirely different. I may think that's Jesus, but somebody else is going to see that and see a white man, and a white man hanging high, and in a whole system where whiteness rules. Then if white Jesus is up there, it's whiteness rules, not Jesus is, whiteness is Lord, not Jesus is Lord. And it's the impact that we have to understand in order to be able to move this thing forward. This is a little bit of an old story, but a thing that happened to me, it's a little bit different now because it's not Jesus, but it's this difference between the impact of people of color skin in pictures and white skin in pictures. I was in Congo for many years ago, and there were pictures all over the place of the head of state, Mobutu Sese Seko. I mean, he was everywhere. And Western people, white people, Americans, especially missionaries, were just horrified that all of the time, every place we went, there's this picture of this man who should, not, they would say, not be lauded in the way that a head of state was at that time. And made no secret about it, and all the time complaining, Mobutu's up there, that picture should come down, One of my Congolese colleagues went on his first ever trip to the United States. And when he came back, he brought with him a Bible, and he brought it into a meeting, and he just slapped it down on the table and opened the front cover. And in the front cover, big as you could please, was a picture of the President of the United States. And then on the picture, the pages that came after that, all of the president's proceeding were there. And he just said, okay, now explain. Why can Mobutu not be up on the walls of our civic rooms and halls? And you in the United States of America, you put your presidents in the Bible. What is this? Well, I mean, it's just, I think it just shows the insidiousness of whiteness, of not understanding the power and that we would just unthinkingly do that and not bat an eyelash. But the power of that Western whiteness, and so the twinning of white unawareness with the incredible power of the whiteness then being melded together with the Word of God. It's shocking, and it happens again and again and again and again in ways large and small. The intent may be one thing, but the impact is what we have to measure when we're talking about white supremacy.
Yeah, wow, Sharon, that's quite a story. And I think for a lot of us growing up in the church, a lot of white people growing up in white church, these conversations, these realizations that come to us embarrassingly late in our adulthood, was reinforced by white Jesus in our white churches, because white Jesus is very polite. And he is meant to bring social order and reinforce social order, and polite Christians don't talk about race, among other things. We don't talk about injustice or inequity, because we don't want to ruffle any feathers, because church is a place where we're all meant to be polite to each other, mistaking politeness for kindness or even mercy. And so it breeds a kind of Christian quietism around things that we deem too political for church. And I just think white Jesus and that white supremacist symbology just ingrains it in us that church, that faith is not a playing field for this kind of conversation around race. And just a lot of us just learn never ever to talk about it at church. Jesus is meant to make us feel better, not worse. Jesus is always kind and calm and trustworthy with our weakness. And so it leads us far away from any kind of conversation that would induce discomfort or confession or recognition of our own cancer, et cetera. It's quietism.
And one thing I'll just add, it's much more practical. I mean, you all have some phenomenal answers, but just if we just ask ourselves as white people, would we hesitate before color correcting the Christmas cards that we send out with the white manger scene before we send them out? Or would we color correct them and send them out? That's the question. Ask yourself that. You'd hesitate. You'd think twice. Why is that? White supremacy. We would anticipate the pushback we would get, and that people would open the Christmas card and be appalled that we had literally corrected the color, right?
I just want to add, first of all, thank you all for these thoughts. I think the question itself is full of so many points that I personally want to spend another hour talking about just this question. But I think we have so many people, ourselves included, in our churches that have just begun asking questions about white Jesus. Or, as a seminary professor, I get students their first semester in seminary and have to take white Jesus away from them. And it's really a traumatic experience for many of them. They've never really considered how white Jesus has been used and to enslave, to subjugate, to colonize. They've never considered text like the slave Bible that actually omits large portions of scripture. And so, these conversations need to be had among white Christians about how we do portray God and what are we saying with our religious imagery? Because that artwork, as David pointed out earlier, tells a story, and it reinforces stories that we tell ourselves as well. And the reality is, so many of us are part of churches that at least claim that we love all the children of the world, but we don't represent those children in our artwork. We don't represent them in our worship. And when we don't have other images of God, we are in essence failing to even honor the image of God by making God white. As a seminary professor, I would love to burst into a lecture about how Jesus is a Jew from the Middle East and most certainly does not have blonde hair and blue eyes, but I will try to resist that temptation because I want to pick up on another point that was part of your question about blessing. The term blessing, especially used on the lips of a pastor, is a theological term. It refers to God's desire for creation to have abundant life. And that is a theological claim. So to say that white privilege is white blessing is really equivalent to saying that God is on the white side. And that is highly problematic. So I'm hoping that, couched in this question of related to events of this week, that we can have more conversations in our churches about what we mean when we do put up images of Jesus where Jesus looks more white than Jewish, but also conversations about what does this say about our theology? What does this say about our view of God? And what does it say about how we see God in others, God in all who are part of our lives? And how would they feel if they walked into our churches and they only see whiteness represented in the divine image?
Thank you all so much. I'm gonna give us one, I've asked for permission for a little bit of extra time. I'm gonna give us one last question to sort of wrap some of these pieces together, and then we'll take one or two questions from the conversation. You all named so many crucial and oftentimes like not even polarizing, like third rail things that we just don't say out loud, right? Like that maybe white Jesus is an idol. That maybe the core things of our faith that we were taught in Sunday school rooms as children were actually about indoctrination and not about faithfulness. Those can be really and Carla, you just named this. I see it at Vanderbilt all the time, right? Those are heart-wrenching things to hear. It feels like people feel like their faith is being torn away from them, their God is being torn away from them. So my question, and this goes back to the thinking about why this is white people's work in part, and thinking about our own journeys. What wisdom, what knowledge, what comfort do you have to offer to the folks who are watching? Not because we just need to be comforted, but because hearing hard truth and navigating really dramatic changes in how we understand what it means to be faithful requires also some care. So for your own life, for your own experiences, can you tell us a little bit about how you have navigated your first reactions to a challenge of white Christian supremacy, and how you got to being sort of a co-conspirator committed to doing some of this work with white folks? Give us just a little insight as to how you've navigated the fragility that comes up, the defensiveness, all those sorts of things. The fear.
Yeah, I think for me, there have been a couple of realizations that have been so important in that. One thing Sharon says, I've heard her say before, is that sometimes the intent is different than the impact. And I have adapted that a little bit to say to myself and then share with others, something can be not your fault and still be your problem. And there is grace in that idea. And there is a kind of emotional release there where you can just move away from it. What if we just took as a given that you're not a racist? What if we just can't get past that? And maybe it is not your fault that white privilege has accrued to you and that white supremacy has trickled down into your subconscious and all of that. And yet it could still be your problem. In other words, it still could be something that you have to work consciously to repair in your own heart and in the life of the world. And that brings me to the second thing, which is that for me, there's been this growing recognition over the last, 10, 20, 30 years, that there are two ways we can talk about the brokenness of the world, the original sin, if you will. And one of those is very personal and individualistic. And for a lot of us in our North American white Christianity, we took on sin as an individual category. But what we are learning from so many people, from womanists, for example, is that there's this whole other way in Pauline theology. It's all right there in our sacred works to talk about the communal problem, the systemic problem, the powers and principalities problem of, in this case, racism, which again, makes it possible for me to not have to take on the whole burden of all the guilt. It's not all my fault, but it is my problem. And if those systems are going to be repaired, I have to be a co-laborer in that work.
Yeah, and I'd like to just jump in to say that I do say often that it's a difference between intent and impact. And I say that because April Johnson, our racial justice minister and Disciples of Christ, taught me that. One of the many things that she taught me. And so I want to say her name out loud as the one who has been helping me so much on this journey, and helping me both through some of the hard patches and some of the easier grace-filled patches. And one who has been honest enough to tell me the truth a lot of times and even put up with my white fragility defensiveness which I think is the way that my fragility tends to show up. What aren't I? So I do want to just say how much it is important to just to thank and give credit, and to know how many are on this journey with us. And it is so hard, and we make so many mistakes, and to be able to have the grace of so many companions. I mean, that's part of how I move forward, is through the presence of incredible grace-filled members of my community who tell me the truth, and then let me deal with it a minute, and then expect me to get back up and get back to work. The other thing that helps, and is just it is just that Jesus said, "The reign of God is among you right now," and I think that is true. And so, looking for that reign of God emerging already, the full love and wholeness of peace, shalom of God. Sometimes I can't see it. Sometimes I can only see it far out. I can only posit it far out. But always, always there is that return to that promise that already it's begun, and keeping that before me, and having people remind me of it when I can't see it is important. And that's partly how I keep going.
I think that
David?
in the last 5 years, there have been 2 days that I can recall vividly when I actually started figuring out how I was going to quit my job. So I went from I can't do this anymore to here's how I'm not going to do this anymore. And they were both days when I definitely felt attacked in ways that were not fair. And wrapped up in that, I think, was some measure of it wasn't fair, but the urge to get out was definitely the fragility piece. I can feel that in my body as if it were yesterday, right now. So why not walk away? I think there's two reasons for me. One is that I think that elementary school self of mine that was driving through East St. Louis, recognizing that something wasn't right, was hearing a call. It was maybe not quite the right interpretation of the call. It was all wrapped up in white supremacy. It probably still is. But the fact that racism in America is something that I'm called to not turn away from, I think came all the way back then. And my sense is that if you're on this call, you probably have some sort of story like that too. The other thing is that one time in my life, I heard Jesus talk to me, like you all are talking on this panel. And he said to me, David, so my whole ministry pivots on this one moment, which is, he said, David, you sound very good about the things you say you believe in. When are you going to start taking some risks? And I think risk is simply saying, I got to do something. I can't do it myself. God, I need you in this with me. And these are all moments that are very much requiring me to show up and not to figure that I can get through this on my own.
Carla, Vic, yeah, anything you want to add before we go to questions?
I would just say that as far as any hope, as a Christian, my only hope is in God's power. I believe the gospel is God's power of justice to rectify God's world, and that God is not going to abandon God's creation to the power of sin, and white supremacy is sin. And in the white church, we have not done a good job of confessing or naming white supremacy as sin. So I hope going forward that we will model confession and repentance. And in the church, trusting God to do what we have completely failed to do and will continue to fail to do. But I think this is ongoing work. We're going to continue to mess up. I've certainly made many, many, many mistakes, and I am sure I will continue to make mistakes. But what David said is true. We have a vocational calling to this task. And that calling propels us to just show up and take the next faithful step, even when we have no clue what that faithful step looks like. And we have to move forward into an unknown that we do not have the power to charter ourselves. And for white people, that can be very difficult.
And I'll just say that one of my first conscious experiences with my own white fragility was the textbook example of the individualism concept, where in the moment when my privilege was being offered to me for consideration, when I was attending an all-Black event, my initial response was, I was appalled because I had the expectation of being coddled as the result of my socialization by a white supremacist society. There was that. But B, I also saw myself as not necessarily being the product of being socialized through racism, but as an individual with good intent. And so being able to see myself apart from the socialization that we're all susceptible to was an example of my experience of fragility and resenting that my privilege was actually pointed out to me at an event that I was intending to support. So. Yeah.
So much. We could keep going. We want to give at least a little time for a question, and some of this stuff will carry over into the next session on July 12th. I think it's July 12th. Sarah, I bet, can confirm that, and Sarah's going to lead us into questions. So I'm going to pass it over to her as she comes back onto video here in a little bit. Yes, July 12th. Okay, great. Awesome. Sarah.
Hi. Well, wow, what a powerful hour and 12 minutes. And I think we've had just hundreds of people on this Zoom with us today, hundreds, like over 300 started with us. So just obviously we have more questions than we can get to, but we tried to kind of pull some together. I think one, the term co-conspirators caused a lot of conversation. And one of the questions was, can you talk about co-conspiracy and abolitionism? How do those words work together? And Katie, I know that you all came up with the term co-conspirator in your journey. You may want to kick that off. You may not. But.
I confess I'm not sure what to say about the connection between co-conspiracy and abolitionism. I don't want to say that badly, so.
Well, the other thing we might do is just talk a little bit. We have a lot of questions here about co-conspiracy and how does that affect the people who accuse, where does the far right accusing progressives of being conspirators, or even just the discomfort for white people to think of themselves as conspirators. That may be another angle you might want to take on it. I know I really struggled with Charisma on the choice on using that word, and so I in my own discomfort. So
yeah, I don't know. Vocabulary is so tricky, right? Every words are not just collections of letters that go together. They all carry some baggage with them. They carry meaning into a conversation, and it feels important to me every once in a while to let some words go as we learn that they're problematic in certain contexts. And it feels important to me every once in a while to reclaim language that we have given up because we thought it wasn't any good. So like in my church, for example, I'm not actually the pastor, I'm the lead evangelist, which I don't always say in every context, because evangelism itself carries a connotation of supremacy and colonialism and all kinds of things, and coercion and manipulation. And But what I want back in the life of my vocation and my church is the possibility of thinking about evangelism as the actual sharing of good news for the sake of someone else, not for the sake of getting more butts in the pew, if we had pews, but for the sake of actually thinking maybe something about this gospel is so good that we can't stand to keep it to ourselves. Yeah. So for me, the idea of co-conspiracy is just, it plays with some categories presented to us in the Gospels, particularly around the messianic secret and Jesus's own insistence at different times that you shouldn't tell anyone what I've done. Although, of course, that radically good news is spreading far and wide. There's just a lot of playfulness around that language, and I don't tend to think it can be seriously imagined that there's an actual liberal plot of anti-racists to do something destructive to, I don't know, to whomever is afraid of that.
I just want to add into that. Sorry, you're over here on my screen. It raises a question of what are you conspiring against, right? And I'm conspiring against a death-dealing system that is literally killing my siblings and dehumanizing me and destroying my soul, right? I have no hesitation about telling you I'm conspiring against that. And I see for myself my own faith trajectory of understanding that Jesus was doing that work too, and so were the disciples, right? The Roman Empire was also death dealing, and also, like, we can tie it back to colonialism and imperialism, right? So to me, that's a question: what are we conspiring against? And when we're talking about abolition, I think about abolition both in slavery, but also thinking now in the prison industrial complex, right? And the ways in which enslavement continues now, right? I'm conspiring against that as well, because it is a part of the death dealing complex, the death dealing system.
It also feels important to say that, I mean, around allyship, you could theoretically be an ally all by yourself, but you can't co-conspire alone. It draws us into the communal nature of this work with each other as white people and with the human family.
Nice.
I have a slightly flip response to this, which is that if we were actually well enough organized that the word that we choose to describe what we're doing was so dangerous that we needed to change it, I'd be all for using a different word. Let's see if we can actually be a little more risky than we are right now before we worry about the vocabulary.
Yeah, I would sort of agree with that. I think our focus is probably better suited to be placed on the work and continuing to show up in white spaces with action and continued action than to really worry about, at this point, like you said, the vocabulary. We know what we're doing, no matter what you call it.
So the hard part is finding comfort in our discomfort and stretching ourselves further. I have one quick question further, Lindsey, I'm going to put out here, and we've touched on it, but it's come up. I do think that folks are wanting to hear more from you all about how white supremacy works and how churches function. Just the actual functioning of the church from a white supremacist perspective. Anybody want to jump on that? I see Sharon. Or Sharon, I thought you were looking to go.
I am. I'm trying to figure out how to say it fast and quick. I think the way that churches function in white supremacist ways is, and coming then out of a majority white church, we bring into our ways of doing things the norms that we're now learning are white norms, not norms. So an example that I would give is, let's say that you call a meeting to engage in a particular project in a church. Let's say, I'm going to say beyond congregational level church, let's say in the middle judicatory or national general setting. And you, being pretty aware, make sure that your committee is diverse in cultural, gender representation, and you set to work to reach your goal. And you start to move along, and you start to run into a disagreement that you can't seem to resolve. You can't talk your way through it, and you've got to be on a deadline because you've got to get this task done at a certain time to report it out at the meeting that's coming up where it's going to happen. And so rather than continuing to talk and work toward consensus, what you do is you take a vote. And the leader says, okay, now we're going to vote, majority rules, that's it. Okay, too bad for the rest of you. We all know how this works. Majority rules and the rest of us go along because we've been part of the committee. Well, that is a white way of doing things. I mean, originally I learned that's a Western way of doing things. And then I learned that's a male way of doing things. But now I really understand that's a white way of doing things. This is how the white culture works. This kind of example is repeated again and again and again and again and again. And when we're trying to move toward a time of inclusion and equity and a beautiful multiplicity of cultures, we can't work like that anymore. We can't bring either or efficiency oriented, decision timeline based ways of doing things. That's not the way communities are built. That's not the way communities are nurtured and the way communities live. And so that's just one example to me of how white supremacy works in the church again and again and again and again. And we can learn and we can do better. We can train our committees not to go straight to Robert's rules, but to really keep working on consensus, really keep working on listening and waiting until the wisdom of the whole emerges, till all have been heard in a way that finally the third way emerges, and we find our path forward. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. Well, I think we have a little more time, Lindsey. How do you want us to go from here? Were there others who wanted to speak to that? I want to check in with you.
Yeah, so I know we got to wrap up in like 8 minutes, and I know the Reverend Trisna has a few announcements and sort of a little bit of a closing. So I don't know if folks have a last thought that they'd want to close on, a short one, and maybe just a couple of folks, and then we'll let Trisna wrap it up. It feels like the most important thing for folks to make sure that they hear and walk away with today, or move away with today.
I have just a little testimony, which is that one of the things that I've been praying for lately, literally praying for, is that I would not only know that God is around, but that I would experience God's presence in the middle of an uprising and a pandemic. And I keep finding that the moments that I most, and there were several on this conversation, the moments when I feel most God's present, when my body is moving literally, is when the truth is being told. And even if it's awkward, clumsy, messed up. And so I just appreciate, I think we should trust that.
And I would just add that a lot of times as white folks, Robin DiAngelo talks about this in the book, and I think it's a wonderful point. We have such a desire to gloss over the harm that's been done as the result of the shame that we feel. And so we minimize the importance of the repair work that must be done before implementing solutions. And so I think it's something that we definitely have an opportunity to consider, how important it is to advocate for reparations in our country. That's such a subject of contention in the white community. Even if folks would, quote unquote, vote for equity and be in favor of work to be done to bring about a more equitable society, reparations is too far, right? They don't feel responsible. It didn't happen in their lifetime. Well, yes, it does happen in their lifetime. It happens every single day of our life. So I think that would be my concluding thought, is just we need to think more about the appropriateness of reparations and advocate for that.
Any other closing thoughts?
Just
I'll
that,
say this. Oh, go ahead.
just that this feels like such a process over years in my life, that new understandings emerge over seasons of my life. Someone gave me the phrase the other day that as you age, you gain altitude. I have gained altitude, but not yet, if God wills it, all the altitude I will gain, and I'll be able to see even more from a higher height. And so there's grace for each other and for ourselves in that, if we stay in it. If we get afraid and back out and retreat from the conversation, that's another symptom of white supremacy, white fragility, and it's a function of white privilege that we don't have to talk about it if we don't want to. So we have to stay in there and be strong and kind to ourselves and each other.
Really,
I'm,
just,
oh, go Carla, go ahead.
I didn't say that echoes what the sentiment I wanted to express. I mean, we have to have these hard conversations, and they may be costly. Some of the hardest conversations I've had are with other white people about race, people that I love dearly. And we start with a position of love. But we have to have the conversations nonetheless. And this is the work that we're called to do. And because white fragility is real, we cannot pawn this off on our friends of color to take responsibility. First of all, those voices have been telling us for a long time that there are problems, and we've been ignoring that. So it really is, if folks hear nothing from the conversation today, I hope they at least are inspired to start thinking about ways they can have conversations with others, and just a moment of introspection of how they tell their own stories, a moment of introspection about how they value the institutions that they are part of, and to start to think deeply about ways that race intersects parts of their life that they may not have at first glance thought that race had anything to do with. And perhaps this can just be a starting point.
I'm grateful to have been in conversation with y'all. It's a helpful reminder that this cannot be done alone, right? We have to do it in conversation, and we have to take the risks. So this is, if this is new to you, if you're stepping into this conversation, this is an invitation to keep moving, to keep digging and keep wrestling, and know that you are not alone in that, and that together we're gonna follow the leads of our Black and Brown and Indigenous siblings, and we're gonna build a new world. And it is possible, and we can do it. We have to do it together. Sharizna, I know you wanted to close us out and give a couple announcements. We've got just a few minutes left. Can I hand it over to you?
Thank you. Let me say, oh my God, thank you all so much for such a rich conversation. Our comment section is on fire. We've had over 300 people viewing, over 60 people, I think it was about 82 people who shared the video. So I want to say to the audience, thank you all so much for pushing this conversation. And to our panelists, thank you all so much. What rich conversation. Thank you all for allowing yourselves to be vulnerable and even possibly uncomfortable. This is a model in terms of what it means to be a co-conspirator, what it means to engage racial justice work in a real, authentic way. This, we hope, is a model for many of you who are trying to find ways to be in conversation with your community about seriously digging into this work and doing some internal reflections about what it means to dismantle white supremacy in our world and nation. So thank you all so much. Because this conversation is not a norm, we recognize planning this that we needed 2 parts. So this was part 1, and part 2 will be back July 12th, 2 p.m. Central Time. The same panelists will be here, and a part 2 conversation will really be more about resources, not just books in terms of what to read, but how do you become a co-conspirator? Around the intentionality, right? What are your intention work that you do personally, internally, communally, to become a co-conspirator? So we hope that you will join us July 12th, 2 p.m. Central Time, to continue this conversation. I do want to apologize to many of you. We had so many questions, and unfortunately we could not get your questions, but what we will try to do is send the questions to our panelists, and if they do have time this week, we'll ask them to answer those questions, and we'll try to put them on the Facebook page. And I say we will try to answer the questions because we do recognize that this is a busy time for everyone. And so if our panel graciously have time to do that, we will ask them to do that, but we can't guarantee that because everybody is busy, if you can imagine. imagine. But again, thank you all so much. And let me close out by turning it back over to Lindsey. Lindsey is moderator. I just want you to close out the conversation around what it means to be a co-conspirator in this hour.
So again, with an invitational spirit, what I would invite all of us to remember as we figure out how to show up well is that we get to practice imperfection, and that we're invited to practice imperfection, and that it is faithful to ask questions and to wrestle and to be uncertain and to still take risks. And for me, that is as a Christian, that is part of the call to be in that work, and to know that that work is not about my own salvation, but about our collective salvation. And if our world is killing our Black and brown siblings, if our ways of being are death dealing, then we aren't living as faithful as we can. So be in the work with us. Let's find a deeper faith. Let's listen to the call of God to truly take seriously what it means to love all humans, to see the sacred in all humans, and to live that out. It's a blessing to be with y'all.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. And one more announcement, completely forgot about this, but I do want to let you all know, beginning July 14th, we actually have a shared learning experience called Becoming Co-Conspirators. And actually one of our panelists is facilitating, Vic Sorrell and Alusha Latribble. If you don't know Alusha Latribble, that's someone you need to know here in Nashville who's doing some amazing work around anti-racism. And so I want to encourage you to check out our website. We posted the link in the comment section about the shared virtual learning space called Becoming Co-Conspirators. This is a space for everybody to come and learn together about what it means to be human and what it means to dismantle white supremacy in our world and nation. This is for everybody. So we want to encourage you to dive deeper each week in July, beginning July 14th, a shared learning space where we will talk more about what it means to become a co-conspirator. So again, the link will be on the comments. The link is on our website and also on our page. We encourage you to check it out, and do not wait to register immediately, because we do have limited seatings. Again, I want to say thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for the panelists, and we will see you again July 12th at 2 p.m. Central Time right here on our Facebook page. Thank you and goodbye. Have a great one.